Well, what I want to talk with you about today is some work that I'm doing that is in development. It draws on my background in visual communication, in particular information design. And this was work that I did here on campus in collaboration with Professor Paul in art and design over in VPA. Social semiotics, in particular the work of Gunter Kress and Carrie Jewett. Also my background in linguistics, descriptive linguistics, and education. And some of the examples I'm going to show you are things that have also been inspired by and adapted by two of my doctoral students, Jiyoung Yi and Ying Chang. What we're looking at is the whole idea that visualization is not something that is new. It is a very powerful means of examining data, and in particular visual data, multimodal data. Now discourse, we know it's all multimodal, as Gunter Kress has pointed out. The only question now is, what is it doing? So as Bill Cleveland has pointed out, no other approach conveys as much information as visualization, and it allows us to establish connections and see patterns that we may not have been aware of previously. So one of the questions we have now is, since we know that the data are multimodal, why is it that the analysis is all verbal and linear, since discourse isn't either one of those things? So the current issues that we have now are really not the collection of more video data. It's extremely easy to collect, and we have tons and tons of data. The issue is how to represent this and how to make this kind of data accessible to not just researchers but also teachers. And this is something that Fred Erickson has recently pointed out, so that we can perceive unexpected patterns and then make decisions based on inferences, from the patterns that we've been able to discern in the data. So Kress and Jewett, some time ago, started looking at the issue of multimodal transcripts. So this is an example based on the work of Carrie Jewett, looking at a dissolving substances investigation that was done in a kindergarten. Now what I'm going to do here today is not detail so much actual results of studies, but to look at ways of examining and analyzing multimodal data that we're working on. Now, this transcript shows the participants different modes or semiotic resources that might be used in a discourse. So we have participants, we have action and gesture, we have tools, and we have speech. Now, one of the problems there are a couple of problems with this. One, all of the modes are represented separately. This doesn't allow us to look at the interaction between the modes. And as Jim Wirch has pointed out, it's in the unity of the modes that we can figure out how to make sense of what's happening in a discourse. We can't really make sense of things by looking at just one thing at a time. Another issue with looking at things in this way is it is a moment-to-moment transcript. It is not an analysis, in the same way that a dictionary is not a grammar of a language. We just have a list of exactly what happened. We don't see patterns. It's just everything literally that happened. So the current task, and a lot of the work that's taking place at the University of London now, is focusing on how can we make the representation be the analysis. So what I've developed and published on in several journals is a visual format. A great deal of the work that's going on in Britain currently is focusing on how to develop a visual format for discourse analysis, not just transcribing. You can use a transcript as a basis But we must move towards analysis. So just to give you a little bit of an orientation to this, it can be read either horizontally or vertically. The basic unit of analysis is borrowed from screenwriting. And this is the beat, which is an exchange of action-reaction. It's not just talk, because very often what we're finding is that, especially in classroom discourse, it's not the language that's doing it. And if we focus all of our attention on the language that's being used, we often miss what's really driving the discourse. One of the teachers that was in one of my grad courses did several visual analyses of a classroom discourse for a child that nobody could figure out what was the issue with this child. He wasn't doing very well. Nobody could figure out why. Well, by doing this type of analysis, she realized that the reason why was because everybody was just focusing on what he said. That wasn't what was driving his interaction. It was other means that he was using to try to initiate interaction with other kids, which weren't working. And this was occupying all of his time and all of his attention, in opposition to the actual content that the teacher was trying to focus the kids on learning. And she actually got congratulated by her principal. She's the only one who saw what was happening with the child, so then they could help him. Now we have also that now a beat too, I want to point out, is a pattern. It's in a sense a kind of abstraction. It will contain the essential and most typical recurring elements that make the interaction move forward. All right? So a beat can recur. It may happen more than once, and there may be a pattern of beats across an interaction. You may see two completely different discourses, and this is one of the findings we had in one of the kindergartens we worked in. We had the same kinds of beats, almost in the same order, in the science discourse and in the language arts discourse. What was happening was that in the science discourse, the teacher was doing language arts. And that's why there wasn't any science learning going on. Now, we also know that not all elements operate equally at the same level all the time across a discourse. So there are three zones in this approach, and this is borrowed from a distance-oriented system of linguistic deixis. The proximal zone contains those elements that are really moving the interaction forward. Those are the most essential things. Now, anything can become proximal based on the research question. What is the focus of the researcher? The medial zone contains those elements that can support or even intensify or contradict what's going on in the proximal zone. And then the distal zone contains those elements that maintain a presence but not necessarily an active one. And they do help to maintain the context. Now, originally this model was designed in Illustrator, and so we had a discourse key at the bottom of every screen. Some of the examples you're going to see, we've done a PowerPoint version that's usable by teachers. And I've been collaborating with a middle school teacher in doing her own designs. One of our findings, too, in using this is that this type of model makes the analysis very, very accessible to teachers. And they can immediately see what's going on and decide what to do. Now, so, just the beat is an exchange of action-reaction. Within the beat, there can be micro-level units, if necessary, in Goffman's sense. So a recurring pattern of linked beats is what forms an interaction. And then interactions that follow a common pattern then formulate a discourse. So the discourse is the highest level unit that we're looking at. So for example, if we want to look at a kindergarten science discourse, this would be a visual analysis of what has gone on across several interactions all the science interactions across 2 years in a kindergarten. We have the children in the proximal zone because the research question focused on what the children's role and their participation in the science learning. We found that the teacher was consistently in the medial zone. So the proximal zone always contained 2 children. There were just 2 kids involved in moving the interaction forward. There were always 2 types of equipment, 2 types of tools that were used. The teacher's contribution was primarily verbal, and it was usually, and it always focused on either distributing materials or being directive, managing the classroom. Do this, do that. Now we have to do our drawings, now make it do this. There wasn't any real interaction, there wasn't any transduction across the zones. What we found was that the kids were doing the science. The teacher was simply managing the classroom. So and our coding categories focused on what was going on in terms of social categories and in terms of a science focus. We found that in the first beat of every single science interaction, both the children and the teacher, all their interaction had a social focus. As the interactions continued, it was the kids who had a science focus, but the teacher just continued a social focus. And in the end, the closure again returned everything to a social focus.
Susan, can you give me a context of what they're doing with science, like what the little lesson was about?
Well, this was across multiple lessons.
Okay.
So, for example, one of them was an examination of owl pellets.
Okay.
Another was an examination of dissolving different solid substances in water with eyedroppers,
Yep.
And so forth.
Okay.
And across all of those, they all patterned the same way. There was never an instance in which both the children and the teacher were engaging in a science focus at the same time. Now, what I want to move to then, now we're begin a study that is taking place in a middle school sheltered science classroom. Now, sheltered classroom, as many of you may know, is one in which all the students who are enrolled are English language learners at various levels of language proficiency. So what we started looking at was, what about moving to some other issues that have been dealt with in terms of pragmatics and discourse analysis? How can we further work on making the representation into the analysis? So we started looking at the illocutionary force of the speech, and this is, of course, comes from Austin. Locutionary acts, we use words, but an illocutionary act is one in which, as we use words, we do something. We give warnings, we give orders, we ask questions. So, but, as we know, Austin's work only dealt with language. What we're working with now is multimodal data. So let's look at the pragmatic functions of other elements that are at play in a discourse, not just the talking. So what happens now, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit, because when we looked at the discourses involved in this middle school sheltered science classroom, we found that there were several different pragmatic functions that did correspond to the verbal functions that were taking place in the classroom. And I want to show you a couple of examples of this. I'm just going to be showing examples from a cohesion activity that the students engaged in which they were to suspend paper clips on the surface of the water in a cup. The students were seated around a table. This is for the teacher. They had cups of water. They each had a fork, and they had paper clips, and they were to try to figure out how many paper clips they could suspend on the surface of the water. And then at the end, they were totaling these up to see, how many people could suspend more paper clips. The research questions focused on student A, because we were particularly interested in his experience of this science classroom. And this is one of the issues that Fred Erickson has recently brought up. What about looking at questions that focus on, what is really a student's, what is that classroom like for that student? And so to do this, we looked at the modes that he was using to move the interaction forward, not just language. Language may or may not be primary. And how does the pragmatic force of the modes used by the student interact with those of the other students at the table? Now, and I won't go into every single icon that was on here. What we found was that primarily, student A, and you can see that he's in the proximal zone, he engaged in a great deal of teasing. And here we have the icon for teasing. So he engaged he engaged in quite a bit of teasing of the other students who were at the table. What he also did, there was a great deal, now student F was also a male. There was a great deal of dominating or directive activity, interaction going on between the two of them throughout the interaction through speech and gesture. Now, one thing I want to point out is wherever you see text that's in italics, that means that those words were spoken in Spanish. Okay. So student A, for example, here, reached across to student F's box of paper clips and looked at student F and said to him in Spanish, "Let me show you." And student F got right back to him and said, "You too, man, don't touch." So they were kind of at odds here. Down here, way in the distal zone, the two female participants were, student E was playing with the box of paper clips and tried to invite student M into the interaction by asking her if she wanted some paper clips. And she repeatedly tried to invite student M. So this represents a pattern. Student M, who had the lowest level of language proficiency in the group, never responded. Now, then we move on. Another one of the functions was this kind of competition, again, between student A and student E. Here, the competition focused on how many clips they predicted they would be able to suspend on the surface of the water. Now, and this was not really a prediction in terms of science, this was a guess. Prediction is based on previous data. What they were really doing was just guessing. And way down here in the distal zone, the teacher was, asking them, she was looking around and asking them, to make this prediction. So they continually engaged in this competition, just a higher number. Now, student A then tries to, invite student F into his zone, asking him, how do you do this? How do you put the paper clips on the surface of the water? He didn't ask either of the female participants this question. These three students, however, he didn't get any response. These three students simply interacted together, telling each other in Spanish how to carry out the task. Again, as we move on, more teasing, more dominating behavior. Student A actually reached across to this cup of water and started trying to pull the paper clips out and tip the cup of water over. This icon means, and I don't have the whole key up here, this student actually slapped his hand and everybody else yelled no. Don't do that. At which point, student A started to insult the student M, again, the student with the lowest level of language proficiency in the group. He said, "Look at the stupid who wouldn't even talk." And however, what he was doing, he was looking at student F. She looked right back at him and said in Spanish, "You are the idiot." Now, the teacher at this point moved into their zone. And this purple is the evaluation through speech and or gaze. In Spanish, she walked over to them and said, bueno. Now, I'll talk in a minute about why this is so large, but that was her evaluation of their activity. Again, we finish up, more competition, more directivity, and in the end, the teacher simply says, "You're at 40 now, what I need you to do, put your materials back." That's it. All right. Now, one of the things we can look at is, we can look at it in a quantitative way, and we can see quantitatively the interaction happened to be based largely on directiveness and competition. This was something that only occurred, one time, but it was highly significant. All right? Another quantitative way we could look at things, we could look at them in terms of language proficiency level. One of the things that's interesting here is what's not here. The male student who was at the highest level of language proficiency in the group didn't engage in any of the teasing, and he didn't engage in any of the insulting. So this was the student who was at the lowest level, simply engaged in being directive and in insult. We can look at things in terms of syntactic complexity, and we can see that most of the talk that went on in English was single word utterances. The multi-clause utterances, even the single clause questions and statements were all in Spanish. Now, this is one thing we know, that talk on task in the first language is fine if it's on task. The problem was, what was going on here? How much of a science focus did this talk really have? So, one of the problems then with looking at things in a quantitative way is that, a single use may be highly, highly significant. It only has to be one look. It only has to be one remark. But that has much more impact, maybe, than something that happens repeatedly over and over and over again. So if we go back here, we can see that the teacher's contribution here carried what we call a great deal of pragmatic weight. It validated the insults, it validated the teasing, and there was quite a bit of transduction across zones. Okay? And so that's one of the things we are starting to look at now. What is the pragmatic weight of each contribution? It may not be just how many times somebody said something. So we're trying to look at ways of working with this concept. Now, there were a couple of times, there were 3 ways in which there was a little bit of science that was foregrounded in this interaction. So we can analyze that using kind of different levels of abstraction. Now we can use the format to say, all right, was there a science function that was going on here? Well, in the beat that was composed mostly of teasing, no, there wasn't any science going on at all. Okay? Now, here in this beat, yes, there was, and this was action or talk for performing the investigation. All right? It was backgrounded, however, because all this was really was they were guessing how many paper clips might be there. Okay? That's all. Here, there was a little bit of, predicting. Again, it was backgrounded. Only in this beat, where they were really showing each other how to suspend the paper clips, was the science foregrounded at all. So we can show this juxtaposition visually by looking at foregrounding and backgrounding. And here we can see, again, there really wasn't any science going on here at all. Only in this one function was there any science activity going on at all. So we can see then that, our findings to the research questions are, in fact, student A's experience wasn't centered on science learning at all. He mainly used oral language, gestures, like trying to grab somebody else's paper clips, and objects to compete with, tease, and insult his peers. He teased and competed with student E, female. He insulted the other female peer, and a little bit of minimal interaction that was foregrounded with student F, who was the other male peer in the group. The teacher didn't engage in any, she didn't bring it to any kind of culmination relating the competition to cohesion, what this had to do with the science concept that was being learned. So we can think about possible instructional modifications. The interaction clearly needs to foreground the concept of cohesion more. Because what we can see in the diagram is a lot of teasing, a lot of insulting, a lot of just competing as a counting game. The teacher interaction could move into the proximal zone instead of staying so distal, and incorporate level questions that are tailored to different levels of language proficiency that allow talk and action about the content. In other words, cognitive academic language proficiency would be addressed. And then the teacher talk at the end of the lesson could elicit the students' findings and link this to the concept of cohesion so that there's more science going on here. So this is what we're working on now, and we're just trying to look at different ways of representing, pulling out the different dimensions of discourse. Since we know, and it's gone way back to the work of Moravian in the 60s, saying that, 2/3 of any given discourse is usually not verbal. So what are the different aspects of the discourses, and how can these be represented in ways that show the kind of the nonlinear and multidimensional aspects of what actually goes on in a classroom discourse? If we have the feeling that there's no science learning going on here, why? Let's look at it. And the work that I've done with teachers in terms of both reading the diagrams and composing their own diagrams, the feedback has been that they said in composing their own, they would say, I couldn't see it until I drew it. And then it hit them. Because we're not just transcribing text. We're looking at all of the different aspects, all of the different semiotic resources that are used in that discourse. What do those do? And how do these recur? So what we're working on is using visual analysis to represent all of the interactions that comprise the higher level discourse that's going on in that classroom. What are the recurring patterns, just as we saw in the kindergarten, where it was the kids who were trying to do all the science. The teacher was simply being directive and passing out materials. There wasn't any transduction. And consequently, the science learning only went so far. So that's what we're doing at this point on the project. Brenda?
So when you go into the classroom, are you setting up several different cameras in different positions so you can capture all of, whether it be oral, visual, non-verbal, verbal behavior?
What we've done so far in the work is we have a group of 4 to 6 focal kids, and so we're videotaping them at this point.
Okay.
So that would be a wonderful thing to be able to use multiple cameras too. Look at this really in a multidimensional way. Yeah, exactly. Yes?
So with respect to number 2, item number 2 here,
Mhm.
I'm assuming that the teacher had multiple groups of students.
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
He or she?
She. Mhm.
So can you give me an example of how the teacher would accomplish number 2?
Yeah, and leveled questions have to do with, there are 5 levels of language proficiency. And every year by law, students are required to be assessed to determine the level of language proficiency into which they fall if they're second language learners. Leveled questions, or as Fillmore has called it, response tailoring, is a standard strategy that's used so that the teacher will tailor the interaction to the level of the student so that everyone can contribute. So for level 1 students, for example, which is the lowest level of language proficiency, you might be asking students to point out certain things. You would use language structures that are a little less complicated so that students, the input would be more comprehensible, so students could respond in ways that would employ either nonverbal response, single word response, or like a 2-word response. Whereas with level 5 students, the teacher might be asking for things that require some more explanation or justification of what's going on. So, for this particular interaction, the teacher might have gone over, and asked the student at level 1, how many paper clips have you got so far? Okay. Can you show me how you're putting those on there? Then she might work with, say, a level 4 student and say, can you look over at hers? Why do you think, let's look at, she's got 3 and student A has 10. Why do you think she would have 3 and he would have 10? What's the difference? Were they doing something differently? Then she might ask, student M, can you show me how you're doing it? Let's look at student. Can you show me how you're doing it? Now let's talk about the differences here. And then bring it up to a level where we're using that term cohesion. And say, now, what does this have to do with cohesion? The way it was being done, you might as well have had buttons or lima beans or anything. It was just how many.
I also, in the sections that you showed us, I don't want to say transcribed, but the images that you showed that captured the interaction, I didn't really see the teacher interacting much at all. So it's not just even the use of leveled questions or not, but any kind of interaction.
Anything would have been good.
Okay, so I did see that correctly. Okay.
She was walking around, looking around. At the beginning, she was handing out papers. And then, and that was why.
Disengaged.
Yeah, this whole concept of pragmatic weight comes into it, because the one contribution she really made, where there was any cross-zone activity, was, bueno, immediately after there had been all this insult.
And I have a question about that.
Yeah.
The way that you represented that one comment shows this sort of pragmatic weight.
Right.
But is that sort of your interpretation of this one comment, that it's cutting across zones and that it I guess I'm getting at what led you to sort of represent it the way that you did?
Recurring instances of the same thing.
So that she would come up and just give a brief comment like that, and that was the end of the...
That was pretty much the end
of the interaction?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sometimes there would be a question. It was quite a bit like the kindergarten teacher. Having not listened to what the students were saying, and then coming up to the group, the interaction, there wouldn't be any correspondence between the teacher's comment and what the students had been working on or not working on. And so, even if there was a comment, it didn't really accomplish very much. And then we would see that things would just continue as they had been, because in fact what she had done had reinforced the idea that that's okay. She wasn't really, they couldn't figure out any real relevance to, it didn't change anything. it didn't refocus the interaction, either verbally. I mean, she could have done something non-verbally too, through using some of the tools, a gesture. None of that occurred either. And so it's the recurrence, and that's why we're working on using the representation as the analysis instead of simply a transcript of one interaction. This is really, there are two levels of abstraction going on here. So that this enables us to look at multiple instances of video data. What are the patterns that we see across these multiple instances? So that then we can see, as we found in the kindergarten, the patterns for the language arts interactions were the same as the patterns for the science interactions. Okay, now we can do something. Now we can figure out what kinds of instructional redesign to engage in. Because we can see that, there were elements of that the children were starting to try to design their own science investigation. In the absence of any, because the teacher interaction was just focused on do this, do that. Here's an eyedropper. So it was the kids, 5-year-olds. Well, they were only going to get about so far. You need some help. But there was no transduction across the zones. So now we can start to actually see, and in looking at these with teachers, they will point out, I've shown that example at conferences, and people have said things like, I'm so sad now. That's just sad. What was she doing? Yeah.
Yep. The approach you use is really innovative. And so did you develop a software for that too?
Yeah. I have designed. And thank you for asking that. In order to be able to have teachers work with this, it's difficult to find Adobe suites in elementary school software. So I designed in collaboration with Rick Paul a PowerPoint version, which contains several different files, so that the basic visual format, a library of icons, and a help file are available so that teachers can use these in PowerPoint to both design their own analyses and project them to others so that more than one person can have access to them. And so that, different people can look at their visual analyses of the same interaction, so that you're really looking at different perspectives. I mean, a small example is when I started working with the middle school teacher and she did her own analysis. Well, visually, the whole thing was reoriented because she designed hers literally from the point where she was standing in the classroom, which was on the other side of the focal group of kids. I had the camera on this side. And then that started to hit us, in a more abstract way, how this could really show, in more than a literal way, different points of view on the same interaction. So that collaboration between teachers and researchers can be enhanced this way. And it hits you very powerfully. Because, as we know, the visual has a big impact. And one of the things that Gunter Kress has pointed out is that, in combination, when you have the visual and the verbal together, it's the visual that's going to get the first attention. Or, both. What we want is both of them together. So, people will see this immediately, and then it triggers other kinds of questions so that you can use this as a way of generating knowledge. The aim of these is not to present the subject. It's to use these as an interface. So that it's not just me, the researcher, telling a teacher, this is how it is in your classroom. So we really have, again, multimodal interaction now between the researcher and the teacher. Yes?
So when you were trying to help the teachers to learn about this method, do they have a hard time learning to do this now?
No. One of the teachers said she actually decided she was going to do it with pencil and paper. She was going to draw it, literally. Still worked, you know. No, everybody had, and especially once we got it into PowerPoint, you know. The teachers actually kind of took over and did their own whole thing, you know, developed their own whole catalog of icons and, you know, designed new kinds of symbols. Because, I mean, they liked working with, you know, how you can insert a symbol, you know, in PowerPoint, and they'd redesign them and think of ways which were very appropriate to design and very economical ways to use different shapes, different colors, different line weights to represent different aspects of the interaction. They were very good at figuring that out very quickly. Okay, thanks.